Hey folks, welcome to another lecture. Today we're going to talk about leadership. And it's going to work kind of like the motivation lecture where we focused on different theories of leadership. So we'll talk a little bit about what leadership is, what we measure in leadership, and then some different ways over the years that people have come up with to explain what makes for effective leaders. So with that all said, let's get into it. So we're going to talk about leadership and also where power comes from in organizations and how these topics are interrelated. And this is another lecture where we could have a whole, in fact, I teach a whole semester long graduate course on leadership. So we're not going to get into all the possible details, but it's more to give you just an overview of how IO psychologists look at and measure leadership in organizations. So we'll talk about what leadership is, where influence and power come from, some different theories for understanding leadership. That's where it'll be like motivation, where we walk through kind of different theories over the years that have developed and what's kind of hot right now. What are people using right now? Then we'll hit a couple of quick small issues, women in leadership positions and cross-cultural issues, and that'll be it. So as with anything else, we kind of start with a definition, right? And the definition that I like for leadership is Ed Locke's definition that leadership is the ability to induce others to take action towards a common goal. And there's a quote up here at the top from a guy named Fred Fiedler who says there's almost as many definitions of leadership as there are leadership theories, and there's almost as many theories as there are psychologists working in the field. And this is all to say that different people use different definitions of leadership. This one we've kind of coalesced around, we've kind of all gotten behind because it hits some common points. Leadership is an ability, one. It's something that people are able to do or not to varying degrees. And it involves others. You're not a leader if you don't have any followers, right? That's a really critical component of this. You have to be able to induce others to do something. And it's not getting other people to do random things. You have to unite people around a common goal, working for the organization broadly, and get them to do something, to take some sort of action. So this is actually probably my favorite one-sentence definition in IO because it hits so many critical parts of what leadership is while being pretty direct and to the point. So let's break that down even more though. What is leadership? What are we looking at here? And leadership involves influencing the attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, and feelings of others. And if you're able to do this, if you're truly a leader, you're going to be more influential than a non-leader. And this is another good time to draw a distinction between leaders and managers. Managers are people that are put in a position of some power that manage, that get things done. Leaders take it a step further. Leaders don't have to be in a position of leadership, although they often are, but leaders go and they don't just get people to do things. They influence their attitudes and their beliefs and their feelings and the behaviors, which is the doing something. But it's more than just being a manager. It's truly becoming someone that people look to for what to do, how to think, and so on and so forth. So especially when we look at, you can look at in your work life, in your school life, or in politics, but we sometimes want to think about where someone's source of power comes from. Someone tells us to do something. Why are we doing it? And this is actually quite old. This is from 1959, but it still holds. French and Raven have their bases of power that are great at explaining the extent to which why someone can influence someone to do something else. That sounds very vague. Why? But it's true. Why are people following someone else? And I want to point out before we dive into these that you can have more than one base of power. You can have multiple of these things or all of these things, but you can have expertise. So people do stuff because you're the expert. You're listening to someone because they know more about a particular thing, not necessarily everything, but they know something about a particular thing more than you, so you follow them. If your boss is an expert in whatever it is you're doing, you're going to listen to them because they know more than you. There's referent power, and this is just where the subordinate likes and identifies with the leader. I like this person. They seem like someone that's kind of like me. I'm going to do what they say, or I'm going to be influenced by them because I look up to them in some way. There's legitimate power, and this is, I'm doing something because you are in a formal role of leadership. So this is kind of like the classic manager role, right? They may not be an expert, you may not like them, but you're doing something because they're the manager, they're the boss, and they're telling you what to do, so you do it. And lastly, we have reward and coercive, and this is the ability to reward someone. So someone does something that you want because you have the ability to give them some sort of reward, whether that's monetary, whether that's recognition, whatever, or punishment. You do something because if you don't, the leader has the ability to fire you or to generally make your life unpleasant. And as you might imagine, some of these are linked to better outcomes, better performance, more satisfaction, etc., than others. Expert, referent, and reward have the best outcomes here. So you're going to do fine, you're going to do well, you're going to be satisfied if you're following someone because you trust them as an expert, and or because you like them, and or because they have the power to reward you. It kind of makes sense. You're going to have less good outcomes. You might perform less well, you might be less satisfied if you're just following someone because they are in a formal role, or just because they can punish you. So really, in the ideal world, you're going to have expert, referent, and reward. And actually, in the ideal world, you'll have all five, but those three are kind of the ones to prioritize. So what do you do if you're a new leader and you want people to buy in? Show that you're an expert, but also don't be a jerk, right? You can show that you're being an expert while listening and learning and getting to know the people that you're working with. And if you have some sort of legitimate authority that allows you to reward people, so much the better. So we can walk through this. I might just say, take a look at this and think for a little bit. What bases of power do these people likely have? Your previous professor? Maybe that's expert. And maybe it's referent. Maybe you like them, and maybe you trust that they know what they're talking about, so you are listening to them. They're influencing what you're doing or how you're thinking in some way. Your boss? I don't know. Jeff Bezos? He's got a lot of legitimate reward and coercive power. He's the CEO of Amazon. He has the power to reward or punish people. He's arguably an expert, and I don't know how likable he is, so I don't know if referent fits. Hopefully, the instructor of your next class has many of these things. As an expert, you like them, and can reward you with good grades or punish you with bad grades. Donald Trump, I think, what's a good way to put this? Mileage may vary based on your political views of which base or bases of power he has. I'll leave that to your own interpretation. If you watch The Office, Michael Scott, what bases of power does he have? He's arguably not an expert, at least as far as leadership skills go. You might think he's very likable, though. He might have referent power. He's in a legitimate role. He's the boss at the Scranton branch of Dunder Mifflin, and he can reward and punish people. And then there's President Hemphill. Again, your mileage may vary, but He has expertise in being a university president. Some people like him, some people don't as much. Um, can reward and punish, and he's certainly in a legitimate role as the president of the university. So one thing to take away from this is your mileage may vary, right? What, you might look at a previous professor and think they have certain bases of power. Someone else taking that class may have a totally different view, and that's okay. We just lay these out to set up the discussion, to point out that there's different reasons why people have influence. And it stems back to the foundation of these specific bases of power. So when we talk about leadership, we talk about different theories. And kind of like motivation, all of these theories have something of value to add. Some of them we use now more than others. So when we start off talking about leadership, we actually start off with what we call the trait approach, where good leaders possess certain innate characteristics, intelligence, conscientiousness, et cetera, et cetera. This was really popular when we first started looking at leadership. Now it's still used, but not as much. And we'll use this moment with the trait approach to talk about some outcomes we care about. When we measure leadership, we often look at leader performance and leader emergence. And these are two different things. And this is actually, to me, very interesting. Performance is how well is the leader doing at their job. And cognitive ability is a trait that is predictive of this. It's different, though, than leader emergence. Leader emergence is who emerges as a dominant or is elected or is put in a position of leadership. It's not the same as performance. And in fact, these two things are sometimes very unrelated. Things like aggression are more related to leader emergence. If you're more aggressive, you're more likely to emerge as the leader in a group, but it doesn't mean you're going to be good at the job. So ideally, people that emerge as leaders are also going to perform well. In reality, though, and if you think about, bosses you've had or things like that, people that emerge as leaders may not actually be up to doing the job. And this is a problem that we run into a fair amount, is how do we select for leadership? We want to make sure we're selecting for leader performance, not for leader emergence. We want to pick the person that'll do the best job in the long run, not that who emerges in the short term as more dominant. Because the cost of picking a bad leader is very expensive from a financial standpoint, from a PR standpoint, from if you have a bad leader, you might have people that are very talented leave the company. So you need to get this right, the leader selection piece, and getting it right means drawing this distinction. So the results of the trait approach have been somewhat mixed, but pretty good in general, I'd say. We can predict performance, we can predict emergence. The problem is a lot of this work has been done in the lab, and we haven't done as much in the real world. So that the leader trait approach is, what is it about a leader? What do leaders have that make them good? And by good, I mean high performing, by the way, in this as we go forward. Another approach is the behavior approach. What do good leaders do? Not what do they have, but what do they do? And there's lots of different ways to break this down. And we talk about this often as leadership styles. Are you more of a servant leader that listens? Are you more of a autocratic leader who just tells people what to do? Those are different styles. Are you more participative? So is it, hey, I don't care what you guys think, you're doing this and you're doing it right now, versus, hey, I'd really like to solicit some feedback and hear your opinions before we make a decision. Those are two different types of behaviors that you can jump into. And the leader behavior approach goes back to a series of studies done at the Ohio State University. Um, they call them the Ohio State Leadership Studies, and we still actually use this approach some. And they break down leader behaviors into two different directions: consideration and initiating structure. And you kind of want both of these, right? But they say that consideration is behaviors that are looking after your employees, checking in, make sure everyone's doing okay, make sure everyone has the resources they need, and so on and so forth. Initiating structure is setting up a structure where things get done, where tasks are assigned so that the work actually gets done. And you kind of want both of these, right? You need the leader to set up, here's what needs to be done, but you also want them to care about their employees and focus on developing them. So we still like this. This is still pretty widely in use. And what we found is having a lot of both consideration and initiating structure leads to good outcomes. Having low consideration, so not caring about your employees, and high initiating structure is actually, and just so like a lot of, hey, you got to do this, is really bad. It leads to higher turnover and more grievances. So this, low consideration, high initiating structure is the boss that says, you need to do this, 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 and this, and I don't care what you think, you're going to do this. Obviously not great. So as we kind of move through time, if you will, in the 60s, Fred Fiedler came up with this contingency theory idea. And it's this idea that leadership is what a person is, their traits and what they do, but it's also the situation they find themselves in. And his suggestion here is leaders should modify situations to fit their own style. And this didn't really catch on as its own theory, but it's totally true, and we've incorporated it into research since then, that leadership isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. One approach that might work in one area might not work in another. So we've taken this and we oftentimes use situational factors as moderators for leadership studies. Does intelligence matter for leader performance, and does it depend on the situation, the type of job, the type of leadership role? So, while not still used as a theory on its own, this is used a lot in how we think about leadership and study it going forward. Another one that's come up that is used a fair amount is what we call leader-member exchange. And this focuses on relational components. What's the relationship between the supervisor and the subordinate? And it's based in this idea, so it's dyadic. It's between two people, just the supervisor and subordinate, and a supervisor could have different levels of leader-member exchange with each subordinate. So my relationship with one person might be great, it might not be good with another. And this isn't just, I want to point out how much you like your subordinate. It's based on competence. So it kind of draws in social psychology that supervisors inherently are going to treat different employees differently, and that you eventually form an in-group and an out-group as a supervisor. There's the subordinates you have that you trust and those that you don't. But as the literature has shown, as the research has shown, it's not, again, based on just how much you're similar or like someone. It's based on competence. And this makes sense because this LMX develops over time. So if you go to a new job and you realize that you start assigning tasks and things like that, and you realize that there's some people that do the job well, and there's some people that are maybe incompetent or lazy, you're going to start favoring the people that do well and maybe stop giving good assignments to people that do the job poorly. And this develops over time, and over this time, you end up with people that you have a good relationship with because they work well with you, and you may not have as good a relationship with people that don't do much. And this has been linked to a lot of outcomes. This is oftentimes linked to subordinates doing well, getting promoted, etc., but also the leader performing well. So when we study leadership, this theory doesn't explain everything, but it does provide insight into, why some leaders and subordinates do better than others. And it focuses on those individual relationships. Next up is what we call the information processing approach, or we call it the implicit leadership theory or prototype approach. And this one also explains some pieces of leadership. It's the idea that we have this heuristic or this prototype in our heads that we're not aware of. And if I ask you to think of an ideal leader, somebody might come to mind, or a certain series of traits might come to mind. Your ideal leader is this, this, and this, or does this, this, and this. But over the years of working with different people, we develop different prototypes. And we unconsciously compare any leader we come across with our prototype. If I have an idea of what a leader is and I meet my new boss and they don't match up to that, I'm not going to view them as being effective. I'm not going to treat them as being my leader. If they are similar to what my prototype is, and everyone has a different one, then I'm going to rate them as more effective. I'm going to follow them better. And this is really important. I think this has been looked at a lot of things like racial bias and whatnot, or gender bias or different kinds of biases, where, if your prototype of a leader is a old white male and you have a leader that's not, it's useful to be aware, like, okay, this person doesn't meet my prototype. Do I adjust my prototype and make room for whatever my new leader is? Or do I stick with my prototype and think badly of my leader? So it's actually a useful thought exercise to go through and think, what is my prototype of an ideal leader? Does it have to be all these things? And when you meet a new leader who doesn't meet that prototype, can you at least be conscious that they don't meet your heuristic of a good leader and move past that? It's hard because we make these comparisons unconsciously. So the trick to working around them is to be conscious that you have this prototype in your head. That way you're aware of it when you meet new leaders and aren't unconsciously judging them against that. We're going to talk about two more theories and then end with a few special topics. But the big theory that we use still in IO psychology, and you see it a lot in what I call airport books, right? If you go to an airport, you go to the whatever bookstore is there, you kind of browse and you see all these business self-help type books that are very, very popular with the people that sit in business class. And they're basically pop psych books, right? They take things from IO research and business research and make them really relatable and distill them. And transformational leadership is something that I see often on those shelves. And it's one of those things that it's actually good because unlike some other things that end up in those books, transformational leadership has a ton of research support. And it came about with this idea of it was developed by some people back in the 80s, but it stems from what we called charismatic leadership that came about in the early 70s. And it was from a guy named Bob House who was looking at leadership, and he wanted to explain why people like Martin Luther King Jr. and John F. Kennedy and Gandhi, why they were such huge figures. And he decided it was charisma. And he wasn't wrong. But after that, people have taken that idea and refined it. And transformational leadership focuses on leaders with considerable and unusual influence who inspire others to adopt high goals and strive to achieve them, often by creating a vision. So this is this isn't for like, not every leader, I want to make the point, not every leader needs to be transformational, but to be a truly great leader, you have elements of these transformational components. And this explains, like, again, your MLK, your JFK, and your Gandhi, they had these things. This is what goes from being like a decent leader to really like above and beyond, where people, you're like unusually awesome at being a leader. The first one, there's four components, there's four parts to transformational leadership. There's idealized influence, where people look to you and they identify with you and they think, we want to be like you, is the best way to sum up idealized influence. When you look at someone and you are like, yes, you are the paragon of whatever it is we're doing. There's inspirational motivation. This is where you can, and oh, by the way, idealized influence is also having that vision, right? Articulating a vision that people buy into. When you say, okay, we want to accomplish this, and everyone's like, yeah, we want to accomplish this, that's idealized influence. Inspirational motivation is just really inspiring people. Intellectual stimulation is the ability to get people to think and think critically, not just mindlessly follow orders, but get them to really get intellectually engaged in what they're doing. And individualized consideration is caring about your followers. That's another important part. You can't just use them as interchangeable pieces. A truly transformational leader is going to truly care about their people. This is a tough one. It might be trainable. There's a lot of things in leadership that we can try to train, but transformational, it's arguable how trainable it is. I would argue you need to have some components, like charisma, to do it, but it's also a product of the situation. Some people are never thrust into a situation where they need to be transformational, where they need to really have a vision and inspire followers and things like that. Some people are, though. Some people end up in those situations and rise to the occasion. But regardless, there's lots of great outcomes from transformational leadership. Leaders perform well, their companies perform well, their subordinates have good outcomes. If you have a truly transformational leader, you're going to do great. But if you don't, that's not the end of the world. You can work on these things, have a vision, articulate it, inspire your followers, get them to think and care about them. There's behavioral components to this that anyone can do. And if there's any takeaway that I have for what you should do if you end up or want to be in a leadership role, is do these four things. Have a vision, inspire people, get them to think, care about them. So this idea of transformational leadership was extended into what we call the full range of leadership theories, and it includes transformational leadership, transactional leadership, and laissez-faire leadership. And this is probably, it's transformational just extended into all types of leadership. And this is what we use probably most often in IO. So we have transformational, that's kind of like the best leadership, but not everyone can be that. So we also have transactional leadership. And this is where a lot of managers fall. You're still kind of a leader, but you rely on contingent reward. So saying, if you do this, you'll get X, right? This is back to basis of power, being able to reward people. If you do your job, you'll get a salary. If you go above and beyond, I can give you a bonus. Transactional also includes an element of what we call management by exception active. And this is a leader who doesn't actively or isn't constantly acting like a leader. They just step in when they see something happening. And like, it's not always bad, but it's, when something's going on, they jump in. And then management by exception passive is only jumping in when something goes horribly awry. So you're hands off until something goes wrong and everything's on fire, and then you step in. And finally, we have laissez-faire leadership, which is the absence of leadership. So not acting like a leader at all. And this is included just to make this theory the full range of possible behaviors. Transformational, really great; transactional, just doing the job; laissez-faire, not doing the job. And I will add that there's a lot of research showing that you have to be transactional in order to be transformational. In other words, you have to at least have contingent reward. You have to have contingent reward in order to be transformational. You have to have some element of transactional. Think of it this way. No one just wakes up and is a transformational leader. You have to have some things you can do that are transactional in this. So transactional is a necessary first step to move up. Or if you want to think about it in these terms, in order to level up to be a transformational leader, you have to be grind and be a transactional leader first before you can level up. So the best leaders we see are both transactional and transformational. So the last theory that we'll talk about today is, and before we get into a few special topics, is authentic leadership. And this has gotten more popular in the last decade or so, and still is talked about. And it comes from an interesting place. Transformational leadership had problems with the "what about Hitler" argument. And what is that argument? Well, what about Hitler? Did Hitler have a vision? Did he inspire people? Did he get them to think? And did he care about his followers? Arguably, yeah. Does it feel great to say that Hitler was a good transformational leader? Not really. He did these things. He was very transformational, but it feels kind of icky, right? So authentic leadership was developed as a solution to that. It was developed to make sure that, yeah, we have to have leaders that do good things. We have to have leaders that are moral for us to call them good leaders. And it contains these 4 components. What we call internalized moral perspective. This is part of the model. You have to be moral. You have to have some sort of moral and ethical code. There's balanced informational processing, so you have to be able to think through things rationally and make decisions based off good information. You have to be self-aware of your own strengths and your weaknesses, and you have to have relational transparency. You have to be open about, everything that you're doing, basically. So this is a good theory. It addresses the issue of morality. We can't say that Hitler was an authentic leader. We can say he was a transformational leader, so that feels better. There's a fair amount of evidence to suggest right now, though, that this isn't that different than transformational. When you look at the research and how much these are correlated, authentic leadership is highly correlated to transformational leadership, and it's not predictive beyond transformational. Transformational is a great predictor of performance. So is authentic, but you don't really need both. So people are kind of sticking with transformational right now. Couple special topic points here. We're going to talk about women in leadership and also leadership around the globe, across cultures. So the good news is there's been good progress for women getting management jobs. 46% of management jobs are held by women. The only problem here is that is often at entry-level management or middle management levels. Women are grossly underrepresented at the vice president and president or CEO levels of organizations. So there's been a lot of research done into why. The first one goes back to the idea of prototypes that we talked about. women don't fit the leader prototype or that idealized leader prototype that a lot of people have. So this isn't consciously discriminating against women, but people often are like, well, maybe that guy over there should be promoted because he's what I think of as a leader. Women are more likely to report not fitting in with management colleagues, especially in traditional industries like banking, where it's very good old boys club. Women may not have as much in common with their male management colleagues, and as such, aren't going to rise up. So the model to look for efficiency here, and this feels weird saying that the federal government is efficient, but they have very, very strict promotion regulations. You have to get a certain number of points in a job to be promoted. You get points for performing well, for having certain degrees or certifications. And if you meet those benchmarks, you're going to be promoted regardless of gender. Now, it's still imperfect, but the federal government has done, we're back to job analysis, as always. They've done so, they know what the jobs are, they know what you need to do, and they have done basically enough like foundational IO psychology work to kind of fix some of these problems. I think back to my mother, who worked as a senior manager in the Department of Transportation for the state of Wisconsin. And she took time off when my sister and I showed up on the scene. But she managed to rise up because she did what she needed to do in the 80s and 90s and 2000s when women weren't in those management roles. And I think she was helped by the fact that she was competent, but also worked for, in that case, the state government. It's interesting that women are underrepresented because there's actually a fair amount of leadership that show that women are more effective leaders. They're more, they give more consideration. They're more democratic. Truly like autocratic, you're doing this, and this, like stereotypical male leader is not effective. That's what the research shows. But that's who keeps getting put in the jobs. Women, once they make it to the top level, are often seen as more effective. It's just getting them there. And that's something, again, with this recognition of like your prototype that we all probably could stand to work on. All right, the last thing that we're going to hit is the idea of cross-cultural issues in leadership. And we talked about culture a few lectures ago, but it's the idea that one size doesn't fit all for leader behaviors and leader traits. What works in one country isn't going to work in another. And this got really popular as like became a huge idea in like the 80s and 90s as Japan was getting increasingly prominent, as basically globalization occurred, as companies started having branches in every part of the world. We had to learn that leadership isn't universal, or good leadership isn't. A better way to put it is what good leadership is looks different depending on where you go. So there was a project, it's still ongoing, it's been ongoing for 20 odd years now, and they keep collecting data, called Project Globe, that looked at what traits and behaviors work in different parts of the world. They wanted to find universals, what works everywhere and what's specific to certain areas. So transformational leadership, intelligence, and trustworthiness are universally good leadership things. They work everywhere, which makes sense. For transformational, we've talked about is good. Intelligence, obviously good. If you're kind of a dumbass, then maybe that works some places, but it doesn't work others. And everyone wants a leader they trust. Things like risk-taking or aggressiveness work better in some countries like the US than they do in others. So like aggressiveness and risk taking are valued here in the US. They're not valued in Japan, where they put such an emphasis on the communal nature of things. Another one, initiating structure is here's what you're doing, is more important in the Middle East. Consideration, the how are you doing, is more important in the US. So again, we could spend weeks on this topic, but the takeaways for cross-cultural are, we've actually done a fair amount of work as a field looking at what works and what doesn't in different countries. Some things, like transformational intelligence and trustworthiness, are good everywhere. Some things work better in some places than others. Americans prefer a more democratic style of decision-making and leadership, which makes sense. Others, like people in India, prefer a more directed style. They just want to be told what to do. So it's funny, you hear about Americans going to work in a management role in India, and when they ask their employees, like, so how do you think we should do this? What do you guys want to do? They're met with like either blank looks or hostility of people being like, no, that's not how we do things here. You tell us what to do, we do it, you're the boss, that's it. And I've heard stories from American executives who are initially so confused about this. So that's really where the value comes in. We learn these things about cross-cultural leadership so that we can train leaders before they go abroad. We don't want to send someone I was just working with a group that has offices in Colombia, and they talked about some mistakes they'd made, to put it lightly. We don't want to send people to another country and say, you're a great leader, keep doing what you've always done, because that might not work. Part of this research is to educate people to say, here's what works in this country. Let's talk about what you've done, and how can we adapt what you've done to something that'll work where you're going to get the best results. And actually, finally, there's this, I'll hit on this really briefly. In leadership, it kind of comes and goes, but we study toxic leadership. Leaders that are in a position of power that abuse that power and have their have bad results, poor performance, tons of turnover, it's hurting the organizational reputation, et cetera, et cetera. And it has to do with toxic leadership, which is not having empathy, not having consideration, not taking others' viewpoints into account, just doing whatever it is you want to do. It comes from lack of intelligence. It comes from having too much of one trait. So if you're a narcissist and everything's about you, you're going to have a really hard time as a leader. Narcissists don't make for good leaders. And it has a massively negative effect on people and organizations. There's been some studies done looking at the mental health effects of people that work for a destructive leader. People are anxious, they're depressed, they hate their jobs, they're not committed to the organization, they might commit counterproductive work behaviors, and they might turn over. Nothing good comes out of having a destructive leader. And I have here nepotism in organizations. This is something that I studied about 10 years ago. And it's a form of destructive leadership because nepotism is hiring a family member. Turns out, so if someone's qualified, like someone's studied the family business for years and they step in and do fine, great. But when you hire an unqualified family member into the organization, then people have really negative reactions. People think that person got the job just because they're a family member. That person doesn't do a good job. And again, you see these negative outcomes like dissatisfaction and CWBs and the like. So toxic leadership, being a jerk of a leader, bad. Nepotism, if the nepotee or family member being hired is incompetent or not as competent as other people in the organization, also bad. It sounds kind of obvious, but things to avoid. So this video covered what leadership is, emergence versus effectiveness and trait theory, and then other theories of leadership listed here. And then we hit on women in leadership, briefly, cross-cultural leadership, and very briefly, destructive leadership. So this was ended up being kind of a long video again, but I just want to say we've totally scratched the surface on this. There's a lot more on all these theories on leadership in general. If you have questions, I'd love to chat with you more about it. But for the purposes of what we can cover in this class, in the time that we have, this is it. So thank you all for tuning in. Let me know if you have questions. Let me know if you're super excited on this topic and want to talk more. But until then, I will talk to you later.